A warm welcome, everyone, and welcome to the last City-REDI seminars of this semester. And today we have the honor to have Professor Nick Henry from Coventry University, and he will be talking about cultural creativity and inclusive place development, the role of creative freelancers. So Nick is a professor of economic geography in the Institute of Creative Culture at the Coventry University, and he is editor-in-chief of European Urban and Regional Studies. And without further delay, please speak.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks very much for the invite. Welcome, everyone. I was supposed to do this about 18 months ago, actually. And if I'd done it 18 months ago, you'd have got a very different presentation, actually, because I was still doing the motorsporty stuff, which I think is what lots of people know me for. Whereas this has been some more recent work around culture and creativity, which does connect to the fact that Coventry was City of Culture in 2021. So it is a bit more work in progress, but let's see what you think of it. And really, what today's presentation is about is, a very quick canter through the fact that, cultural and creative industries clearly have a relationship with local and regional development. For the last 20 or 30 years, the shift, I guess in some senses I've done motorsport and automotive and advanced manufacturing and so forth. Meanwhile, there's been this whole other set of culture and creative industries which increasingly have some representation and recognition within a post-industrial knowledge-driven economy and other languages like that. And there's actually quite a lot of diversity in terms of what they are and how they relate to local and regional development. So if you think of longer term shifts in economies and how we think of economies, there's that interest there. But alongside that, what I want to do is try and connect that up to the fact that there's a moment at the moment about where we're arguing that how we've thought and theorized in urban and regional development is actually under quite a bit of challenge and rethinking and reframing, which is being driven by things like left behind places and so forth, but I think has a much longer trajectory in terms of thinking through some of the orthodoxies of urban and regional development and what we mean by economies. And I think this is a moot moment, and what I'm going to do is show how some work we have just done on creative freelancers actually reflects some of these reframings of what we think urban and regional development is and how it works and what it means for places and people. Hence, ending up with culture, creativity and inclusive place development. And the from and to is the punchline right at the end. So hopefully I'll get there in not too long a time. So what I'm going to do is just very quickly, I mean, this really is a quick sweep through just reflecting on the fact that, when we think of cultural and creative industries, there are all sorts of ways in which those industries are being defined and what they might include. And as economic geographers, if you come from an economic geography or a background, the range of relationships between the economic activities of culture and creativity and how they impose on urban and regional development, cities, places, clusters, and so forth. There's relationships. If you think of tourism, if you think of galleries, if you think of create tech, if you think of gaming, if you think of museums, if you think of heritage. So all that language, all of those terms are terms for aspects and bits of the cultural and creative industries. But as an economic geographer, you immediately have different spatialities attached to them. And how do they, classically, how do they impact on economy and society and places? So the first one is the more historical one is the cultural industries of GLAM: galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. More recently, they've become part. The notion of heritage industries only really grew in the last 20 plus years, and they've moved from being about. Libraries were about local authority provision of a service, and archives and museums, they become part of heritage industries. They've then been connected into visitor attraction and tourism. And you can see how economic development and economic geographers, just been translating those types of relationships and doing loads and loads of studies, and there's new journals around it and so forth. So they have a particular connection in terms of local economy and particularly place and image. And actually an interesting thing most recently is how libraries, archives and museums are now being viewed as part of social infrastructure, a new language of social infrastructure, returning to their role in communities and its community infrastructures, and the fact that actually they need to be doing more outreach work into communities. So moving away from some of the heritage stuff and actually being a questioning once more about what is their role in the economy and society. So, you know, things like libraries have been, you know, they've become food hubs, they've become warm spaces and things like that. So a very different articulation of what a library is, which is very different to being part of information society and so forth. That's one example. Alongside that is clearly the cultural industries of commercial media and entertainment, much more into the notions of business districts. Where do they coalesce? Notions of urban agglomeration and clusters, the languages of nighttime economy, and then also the recognition that culture is much more than just, you know, elitist forms of culture and notions of popular culture, and how do we engage as individual citizens in culture, notions of cultural participation, and you start thinking of different venues for cultural participation, you know, pubs, clubs, nighttime economy, non-elite spaces. It's not about museums, it's not about archives, very different sets of spaces, which are much more diffuse, and even pushing as far as everyday DIY creativity, which again became very important in the pandemic. One of the interesting things about the pandemic was how you had a different reading of culture and creative. So all the creative industries, you know, in the sense of go and visit somewhere and go and see a show, you know, absolutely stopped overnight. But other forms of creativity came through in terms of digital creativities and trying to support communities in terms of well-being and mental health type notions of culture and creativity. So I'm just skimming through here just to give you a sense of, I guess the point I'm trying to make is how we often take one of those objects of study, one of those particular forms of sector or industry, and think through what it means in terms of its spatiality, what it means for a place, what impacts it has on people, society, and economy, if you like. And there's such a diversity going on there, is really my point. And then, of course, that's before we hit what has essentially become the all-conquering term, creative industries, which was very much driven, you know, as almost a policy-driven, pragmatic, but incredibly powerful term to bundle up all these cultural and creative industries and sectors and not worry too much about how tightly you define them, although we'll come back to that, although there were arguments about what should be in and out. But as a term, it's a nice malleable term, which has definitely caught the imagination within economic development policy and so forth. If you come from that more traditional background of culture and creativity, which I don't, this is still relatively new to me, it's very much seen as a neoliberal commodification of culture and creativity in forms of thinking through the culture and creativity inside those types of sectors. But it has, I think, been very powerful in capturing, just as we use the term advanced, you know, in the UK, we use the term advanced manufacturing, great catch-all term, which allows you to talk about the sweep of manufacturing matters, and then you immediately connect a geography to it. I would argue that creative industries has had that same sort of impact. It allows policymakers to grab hold of something and see these notions of big, it makes a difference, it changes the world, we've got to engage with it and understand it. So the creativity, you know, creative industries is across sectors and occupations. It's creativity in certain sectors, but it's also creative occupations in other non-creative sectors. It's definitely across digital, across technological change. It's been connected up with digitalization, and the latest term is create-tech, and you can see how that immediately captures imaginations. But I would argue it's been much more about this notion of structural, economic, and social change. It's been connected up to bigger models of how the economy is changing. You know, initially it was information society, then there's things like knowledge economy, post-industrial. Some people would argue post-capitalist, if you're trying to think that through. And, you know, Florida's creative class. Yeah. Now, that's immensely one of the most powerful terms. I mean, whether you believe in it or not, I mean, I'm not going to go into it in detail, but the point is, all of you smile because you all have heard that term. Florida's been, you know, God, he's sold it everywhere. Yeah. But actually, it also, you know, if we were talking about manufacturing classes before, or working classes before, or consumption classes, my point is the power of how that's changed. It's brought creativity to a level where policymakers and governments and big thinkers recognize a very different form of thinking through how do we develop and how do we understand cities and how do we do city development. Yeah, so it's about creativity and class and tolerance, and it's shifted the languages and the mindsets, and that's what I'm trying to get at in the sense of why cultural and creative industries as against some of the other things. And alongside that, of course, alongside any form of economic dynamism comes boosterism beyond belief. So we have regeneration quarters, creative cities, creative clusters, super cities, hubs, districts. Well, you can keep going. We all know them, yeah. But there is some truth behind them, because sitting behind them is people trying to capture a sense of economic dynamism, innovation, new forms of economy, new types of occupations. So I can be here and take a sort of, and I was a policy consultant, so I played this game before. But they're sitting behind these labels, and why they capture is because there's an element of dynamism and truth behind them. And we've even now moved into the notion of temporary spaces with mega events, and this region's had City of Culture and Commonwealth Games, trade fairs and so forth, and the importance of how they bring economic activity and wealth to a region, even if it's for a short period of time. But those are very, very different geographies to some of the geographies we'd have been studying 20 or 30 years ago. They're often much more fluid, and that's something else I'll come back to as well. So in that sense, it's me as an economic geographer thinking through periodization and changes in how you understand the economy and the spaces which go with the economy. And then and those spaces are the spaces of urban and regional development and policy making. So that's really why I'm rehearsing all that lot. So if you try and get Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, which it's lost the digital in the last year, presumably for another year until we get a new government in. So anyway, but they like changing the labels on the doors. But I think all this one really shows is, so it moves beyond their version because there's sectors which go beyond. It's just to give that sense of what is the cultural and creative industries. Well, there you go in a diagram. Good on them to try a diagram. You can see the overlapping. And my point is that sitting behind that is those geographies that we talk about. We can spend, and we do spend a lot of time trying to work out exactly how to measure the edges and so forth. But I think it's much more about the relationships between and the fluidity and how there's synergies and innovation and development inside those. Yeah. And the reason why it's difficult to map them is because the economy is constantly in flux in some senses. But we have to map them and we have to measure them. But at the same time, we need to understand that there's this fluidity and this ability. And culture and creativity is a particularly useful term, just as I was saying, the big historical ones. And it's important for me, and it brings you to a different set of sectors. Yeah. Against some of the boys' own economic geography, which has happened in the past, of which I fully recognise I was part of. So in summary, my understanding of that diagram and the way of doing it is actually you've got a hybridity of institutions, finance, funding and business models actually going on here. Subsidised, highly commercial, not-for-profit, foundations, a mixture of actually institutions and funding streams. We've got a connection to that variety of local and regional economic development, agglomeration, clusters, but also diffuse community infrastructures, all that business districts and language and so forth. So explicit and implicit relationships to space and place. But I would also argue that if you look under the visuals, what you'll see is shared labour markets. People, if you look at people's careers, they move between and across those sectors, between different forms of for-profit, not-for-profit, charity, continually in terms of their career trajectories. And there's a very, very substantial freelancing attribute to that. So estimates have put levels of freelancing in these sectors at even as high as 40 to 50%. There's certainly 2 or 3 times the average of freelancing in an economy generally, where freelancing has become an increasing aspect of a dynamic modern economy. Freelancing and micro enterprises and all that, and entrepreneurship has all been going up in economies. It's been going up even more in the creative sector, and sitting behind the world-class UK creative sector is a large amount of freelancers. And the creative economy as a whole has been outperforming the UK economy, the European economy, and the global economy. And yet sitting behind it is an industrial organisation around micro enterprises and freelancers as much as multinational, as much as multinationals, so very bifurcated. So it's a different form of thinking through. Hence you get shared R&D and innovation. Museums and archives are sites of innovation, for example, for these among creative communities. And so for me, what I'm trying to get across is this notion of a relational, interdependent and fluid sense of sectors and the industries, but it is structured. That doesn't mean it's just chaos. There's structure in there, and it's about understanding that structure, whether it's through labour markets or innovation systems and so forth. And so we do see, there are others who have been, as I say, I'm relatively new to this part of the scene. So there are others who are conceptualizing production and consumption. We know about global production networks, we know about tiers and supply chains and so forth. Well, how do we use that type of language to think it through in this type of environment? So you move to networks and so forth. And there is a particular language which has come to the fore from people like the King's College London team, which is around notions of ecologies and ecosystems, which are this much more sense of fluid, ecological, synergistic systems which continually move across those boundaries, and I think are really useful to understand this type of sector, especially if you spatialize them, because I think that's where you get into notions of ecologies of place and so forth. And for me, it does connect for me back to the work I did do on Motorsport Valley, because when I did do the work on Motorsport Valley, the punchline I had when I was using actor network theory and science technology, STS studies to map knowledge flows, looking at how interlinked careers were happening, looking at the family trees of businesses and how they all span off. Those were all different systems of economic activity, which mapped on top of each other to create a region called Motorsport Valley. And those all changed, but Motorsport Valley didn't. It didn't. So the unit study was the region, the valley, not the business, not the individual, not the labour market. So because the businesses came and went, if anybody's interested in anything to do with Formula One or some of those other companies, the names on the badges continually change. Yeah, they're sitting underneath it. They all may continually change, but they all stay in Motorsport Valley. Now, Motorsport Valley is much more. So it's that sense of understanding that there's a fluid and dynamic and related system, which has led to that cluster having 50 years of almost continuous growth, and bounce back to, and I think the notion of an ecology and a spatialized ecology for the culture and creative industries is a nice way of capturing that same sort of how you understand an economy. So that's a very long-winded intro to that. So if that's how I understand regions, what's been interesting is a moment of reflection especially by the Kurds group up in Newcastle, but working with the European colleagues as well, around this notion of left behind places. That we've had an orthodoxy in economic and industrial policy, which has failed to deal with uneven development across Europe, globally across Europe, and certainly in the UK. And in fact, despite years of doing this form of policy, we've actually got this notion of left behind, uneven development, which is as extreme as it's ever been, and the notion of left behind places who have made people sit up and wonder what's going on because they kicked back politically. Yeah, suddenly we have a political kickback from these places who were supposedly part of an urban and regional development policy making system, and have basically said, no, we weren't. We weren't in the super cities, we weren't in the metropoles, we weren't in those science quarters and clusters, but we were all here. We're actually quite big, and we're big enough to change the political landscape of the UK and Europe, because we keep voting for those authoritarian and populist people who are saying the sorts of things which we don't want to hear. Yeah, so that's laying it online. But actually, you can see how that's all come through. I would argue that's come ever since the global financial crisis to the COVID-19 pandemic, and you've seen all these different flows of different forms of change which have been pushing at that global orthodoxy, and I've listed some of them there. Maybe I should do the acronyms. New social movements, that would be gender-based violence, Black Lives Matters. We now got this term called polycrisis, and the attempt to try and respond to shock and crisis is a continuous thing. VUCA is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, which is used by the latest futurist policymakers So, which all seems a bit over the top, but it gives that sense of change, but also battling at those structures and assumptions of what sat behind our urban and regional development policy, which has delivered the most unequal society we've ever had, across many economies. And actually it's come from a notion of spatially blind, but inherently biased economic industrial policy. We've shown the work where only about 1 to 2% of UK funding has ever gone into regional development. Meanwhile, if you look at the spending in terms of transport, in terms of health, in terms of notions of trade policy and so forth, it continually implicitly supports and sustains certain bits of the economy and not others. The easiest one is whenever you do tax breaks, and then you look at or housing breaks, where you look at and it influences those people who have the most money, who have the largest things, which happens to be the southeast. Remember the time when Thatcher cut the tax rate? I think it was from 50 to 40%. I think it was Chris Hammett then did this analysis of what that meant for the southeast. Basically, it meant popping champagne corks in the southeast, because up in other parts of the country, people weren't even in that tax bracket to begin with, and then suddenly you're given a 10% tax bracket. Or the housing system, all those people in the southeast who are inheriting houses from their parents and so forth. So there's all sorts of ways in which the system constantly inherently is biased to certain parts of the economy, forgetting anything we do in terms of spatial policy, where we say we've got to deal with that problem. And sitting behind it has been a growth-orientated new economic geography model of how you do industrial and economic policy. And therefore, you've seen places which aren't part of that being viewed as being in a deficit. What they need is more. If we do what we aspects of smart specialization is a bit like that. I mean, it's tried to say you look at the assets in your region, but it's like this is what supposed successes looks like. Therefore, if you look over here, they haven't got that. So what we've got to do is they've got a deficit. They haven't got assets. It's because they don't look like the successful places. Therefore, let's make them look like successful places by investing to make them look like this, on the basis that they don't have it. So we need to put it in there, or playing catch up. And the story of uneven and combined and uneven development is that it's not a zero-sum game in that sense. So UK levelling up is, as an economic geographer, doing these debates for decades, and others doing it much more strongly than I ever have. UK levelling up was one of the first real recognitions that actually this uneven spatial inequality has been here for long and it's not shifting. So it's a great start if you look at the analysis of it. Unfortunately, the gap we've got to cover in the UK has been, Philip McCann has shown that it's about the same as the reunification of Western and Eastern Germany. That's the scale of the gap we've got to close in terms of doing uneven development in the UK. And they calculated that was the equivalent of £71 billion of policy investment every year for 15 years in Germany. So you get into trillions. Currently on our UK levelling up, I think we put £4 to £6 billion in over the last couple of years. So yes, as a start, but we start to see what the scale of difference is. And EU cohesion policy has always been about territorial development, and that's been great. But now we've had this EU recovery, and they've actually done much more place-based notions of policy. And we now have EU Recovery and Resilience Facility, which bizarrely is actually spatially blind and may well actually work against cohesion policy. And there's many other people who know much more about this. But actually in Europe, there's going to be this battle between this almost overarching macroeconomic response, classically that spatially blind stuff versus EU cohesion policy, and they don't necessarily work together. They may actually work against each other, and that's going to be a battleground in Europe from what I understand, but I'm not an expert on that. So the reframing of urban and regional development, because of that, to use this quote, it's necessary to overcome the limitations of conventional growth-orientated economic thinking and its narrow prescriptions for left-behind places. I don't think it's about left-behind places. I think it's about all places, thinking through of what we mean by economy for places. It needn't be just for left-behind places. A new conception is required to provide a wider understanding of the economy beyond market exchange and economic growth, and to incorporate issues of belonging and attachment. So I'm now currently doing work for arts and humanities, and so notions of belonging and felt experience of place and so forth comes from very different notions of culturally inflected notions of place. And it's interesting to see it coming into economic development models as recognizing that that's part of what a place is. Yeah, and of course that comes back to, in the UK perspective, well, the notion of left behind places across Europe. But I think what that leads to, and this is the point I want, is generates a fuller understanding of the social and economic activities, infrastructures and assets found in such places. And that's the bit I want to really focus on. What do you mean by the economy and its assets? So therefore I want to reflect that through a piece of work we did on creative freelancers a couple of years ago. Because I would argue that the analysis we did there sort of shows how, if you rethink what you mean by the economy, you take a very different view of the value of this part of the economy. So I've given you a sense of actually how they're an under the radar, often precarious part of the workforce, but in actual fact, they're critical to new forms of production. This piece of work was done because it was basically done for Waltham Forest, because they, which is in a borough council in London, because they knew they had a lot of creative freelancers in their area. And as a local economic development, they didn't know what to do with them, how to support them. They couldn't get a handle on them. And my point was they were in there and off. There were people coming in and out of Waltham Forest. But also at the same time, there was this Creative Industries Policy Evidence Centre set up in the UK. And so I put together this consortium and they are interested in that point about freelancers and micro enterprises' contribution to creative industries. So we put those two together. We interviewed 84 creative freelancers. Importantly, if you look at the interview guide, that was about how those individuals and their micro enterprises were embedded inside their place, inside their household. They're socially embedded. They're not just economic units. They're people. They're individuals. Yeah, doing creative economic activity, but doing it as parts of socially embedded individuals. And so it's a much more embedded sense of economic activity, which I think is critical to understanding place. Some of our problems is that we divorce it from those other broader social relations. So we asked them questions on average. I mean, the interviews on average were over an hour long. And this is work with Victoria Barker and Kevin Broughton at Coventry, and Paul Sissons, who was at Coventry, who's now at Keele, and Peter Dickinson from IER and Warwick. So there's a group of us, and we're actually doing some re-interviewing of these freelancers at the moment. And what we did, this was a policy-orientated piece, was what you got was actually, what we created was a typology of creative freelancers, different types of freelancer, and what was their motivation to be a freelancer, and how they viewed their role in the economy and society as someone who'd chosen to be a creative, this economic community called a creative freelancer. So on the left, you had a creative entrepreneur. That's that notion of that creative entrepreneur setting up their own SME, ideally being high growth. If you put the word high growth in front of them, someone will business support them. If you don't put the word growth in front of them, they'll look at them and go, I don't know what to do with them. Why should I support them? Yeah. So you get, yeah. But you also get creative contributors, which are just skilled freelancers working for all sorts of organizations and doing portfolio working because they like the autonomy around personal growth within and beyond the creative industries. Creative work-life balancers who are doing creative activity, but often doing it part-time or in fragmented working, partly out of choice, partly not out of choice, had other income streams, which may be connected to other forms of employment, may be connected to the household, or they were doing other activities, caring, family activities and so forth. Precarious projecteers, which was that notion of project work based on the gig economy. I'm going to run through these quite quickly, but creative ecologists, and these were individuals who want to do art and culture. They want to do the ecology of art and culture and contribute to humanity, human flourishing, local community and society by doing arts and cultural stuff. That's what drives them, yeah, not the economic reward, yeah. But they were deeply embedded in local networks, and they were still being paid for this, but that wasn't what was the driving. And then you had community creatives who are often doing using arts and cultural methodologies, say in community-based settings to do around mental health or engagement or supporting OAPs, and, you know, against isolation and cohesion and those sorts of things. So public social goods. So actually inside this creative freelancers, I would argue that very different forms of value being generated, all located in place economies, only a few bits of it viewed as economic. Yeah? Even though they were all generated, you know, we interviewed them when we said, we asked for creative freelancers to come forward who believed they were creative freelancers to be interviewed. They chose to self-identify as creative freelancers. And these localities all had these people in here. So you can see why an economic development policy officer is scratching their head somewhat in trying to understand what this group means. But you can start to see the value of this group if you look at it. And that's my point. So we did do policy recommendations. I'm not going to run through all these, and the point about policy recommendations is getting the track. You know, it's no use putting a recommendation forward if there's no traction into the system. Yeah, I mean, you always have to play that off as the politics and technicalities, but also who's going to pick it up. So when we did these policy recommendations at the top level, you know, policy domain 1 was freelancers in a changing labour market. That's about freelancing as a new form of employment in the UK and European economies. So that's national level policy, you know, the movement for good work, income and employment schemes, you know, how do they engage with adult skills and lifelong learning, so and systems like that. The next level was good freelancer employment and procurement charters at the practice of those venues, those organisations like theatres and production studios, who actually do employ, their supply chain is all these freelancers. Yeah, what happened for large numbers of those freelancers when pandemic came? Their contracts were just cut overnight. There was no moral or ethical responsibility to their supply chain. You know, everyone closed in, and actually there's been a response now by the cultural and creative sector to learn from that. So, but that's that point about that supply chain is critical to their ability to produce the system of world-class creativity we have today. And yet when it came to the crunch, we're not part of our organisation, we don't have responsibility for it. But in terms of a supply chain and in terms of a place economy, they are critical to that system. Yeah. So who's going to look after that part of that asset, if you like? And then the final one was, we were just hinting at place-based policy domain 3. I'll just go into that in a bit more detail to give you a sense of how trying to change the mindset of how and the economic language. So it's said about investing in creative freelancer infrastructures. So remember, this was written in the middle-ish of COVID. Yeah. So the point is that these creative freelancers, their working space is home working. Now, we all know about home working now. I mean, most of the people in this room were probably told by their, certainly we were in Coventry, we suddenly had to do our workspace assessment at home and tick a box to say cables are in the right place, we had the right chair and everything else, and therefore the university had covered any responsibility to what we do in terms of home working. Yeah? Now, a more systematic response is to recognise, you know, that's about connectivity. We use the term energy. Think about how important energy has become in terms of home working today. You know, but it's also about the planning system and the ability to work in home, care provision systems to support that. Spaces of creative freelancing, co-working network spaces, hubs, showcase spaces like the galleries and the street art, market, pop-ups. So all I'm doing is what I'm trying to hint at is how it changes what you view as the spaces and assets of the economy when you're thinking through this type of lens. Yeah, rather than setting up another innovation or science park. I know around Birmingham, we're doing that quite a lot at the moment in terms of medical and so forth. I'm not against it, I'm just trying to suggest other parts of the economy as well. And the institutions of the cultural ecology. So those archives, those museums, those libraries, they are the science, they are the equivalent of the science-based assets, yeah, for the cultural and creative and content-driven sectors. That's where people get their ideas, learn from the past, those textile collections and those sorts of things. Yeah? And then the other one is very quickly, use of place-based policy to recognise value generation of creative freelance and support of place-based outcomes. So if you use that typology, you come to very different notions of how you support those individuals. So I mentioned creative entrepreneurs, business support for their economic output, but also their cultural value generation. If we don't value that, we don't invest in them. So we underinvest in creative entrepreneurs because we're only investing in part of the value they generate. Really interesting one, creative work-life balances. So that is the inclusive growth mix. So they're enabled, they are participants in the labour market. So in terms of those notions of productivity, it's very important that they are part of that productivity, you know, the usual way we think of productivity in terms of participation in the labour force. But they were contributing to a much greater place-based productivity beyond that, because they were also doing mixes of social and cultural value, depending on what else they were doing with those unpaid hours, which may have been volunteering, it may have been doing other cultural activities, it may have been caring, it may have been family support. So there's a whole bit of value which they're doing, which is just, and you know, feminist economic geographers have discussed this for years about not being counted and understood in terms of a place-based economy, rather than just this narrow notion of economy. The ecologists who create that, you know, all that creative class buzz and everything else, well, those are creative ecologists. That doesn't just happen. There's people there generating it and contributing that as a public good. So it's just a different, makes you think. So when you're thinking about business support, just changes what, yeah, changes the metrics to some extent. So what I hope to have got across to you is that by using creative freelancers as an exemplification of a broader approach to development, it immediately changes some of the lenses of those economic and social activities and assets and what you're trying to influence. But I think, interestingly, if you look at the cultural and creative industries, you do get a much more, and especially freelancers, you get a much more rooted, even tangled notion of place. Yeah, they do have. And I haven't explicitly talked about their relationship to place, but I don't need to, in the sense if you think about labour market, household unit, how they have an affinity to place and so forth. You know, you can work that through, and some of them are mobile and they'll go and so forth. But intrinsically, you can see a slightly different relationship to place. And this doesn't mean localist. This isn't a reversion to localism. This is neo-endogenous in that sense, because those entrepreneurs, those contributors, those precarious projecteers, they are working for organisations and funding streams which are extra local, which are outside of the locality and in other value chains. They're not, it's not as though they're divorced from them, they're still part of them, but they're also rooted into a particular place-based way of living, if you like. As are ecologists and creatives who may be being funded by the National Lottery Fund or, you know, Gulbenkian Foundation and so forth. So it's not as though, I mean, ICLES does things like local wealth creating and building, which is important. Birmingham's been a city for doing that. So it's not to deny these external relations, it's just to try and think through that relationality outside as well as inside the locality. But it significantly expands and rebalances the social and economic activities, infrastructures and assets of development. So that's the straight lift from that earlier quote from McKinnon et al. Yeah? And it's about the actually existing assets. All those assets I've talked about are actually existing assets rather than a deficit. So you'd find those sorts of things I've talked about in virtually every place in the UK. Yeah? You wouldn't have to look very far to see those, whether they're defined as assets for the economy to build on, whether we have an understanding of where those freelancers are and what they're doing. So it's not about, so it flips it to an asset-based notion of development, not a deficit-based or an aspirational. No offense to the black economy, black country economy, but 30 years ago, when I was doing work for black, I was being told, we want to be world-class in this 30 years ago. You know, we want to be the next Silicon Valley. And, you know, and it's just like, yeah, it's all okay. There's certain things we can do, you know, we can connect you with different dynamics, and the black country's doing quite well, but you know, you're not going to become another Silicon Valley. Yeah, let's get some realism around some of this stuff. But it was because that was what the game you had to play, about being aspirational, about the model you're supposed to be following all the time. And the point about left behind places and the reframing of urban and regional development is that we've just been caught in that particular mindset, and yet there's other ways of thinking through, which are much more about place economies, you know, and the notion of returns to place, because we're supposed to be trying to find prosperous, livable, socially just places for people. Yeah? And if you mix with cultural and creative, they would talk about, you know, their language is human flourishing. That's their starting point. Yeah, not the economy per se. The economy is a means to an end. Yeah. So stimulates possibilities for inclusive and sustainable place-based policies. So I've just given you a flavour. But the bigger feed is into these alternative framings of orthodox local, urban and regional development policy. So this is where, I mean, when I accepted to do this seminar, I was going to talk about Coventry City of Culture and the work we've been doing on that for the last 2+ years, but the materials are not in a position to put out there yet, and if anybody's in the region, they know there's quite a lot of politics around that at the moment. So I have had to put this together in a slight hurry in the last few days, but really, what I would say is that, you know, that point about ever since the global financial crisis, you have seen a flotilla of conceptualizations of alternatives, framings, and models of the economy. I've just listed some of these. Inclusive growth, unsurprisingly, and Anne's done some great stuff around migrant skills and the local hospitals, and there's all sorts of really good. But you know, the inclusive growth is the bit the policymakers like, because it's quite easy to pack it inside the initial framing and just remove the barriers and just think a little bit further. Yeah? Some of these other ones are a bit more testing. You know, the work way back from the Gibson Graham and the Australian community economies, diverse economies groups, informal economies. You know, that's all about. Yeah, I know very little about that, but that's all about, you know, particularly about global south notions of development and how that actually is increasingly being reflected in Western advanced economies. Social and solidarity economies, the massive growth in mutualism and all sorts. Everyday and foundational economies, and foundational economies being picked up in Wales, in particular donut economies, and there's others, they're care economies. So there's lots of alternative conceptualizations, which I think are playing around with this same redefining of how you do economic regional development. Now, interestingly, where culture and creativity sits inside these different models is an interesting exercise. They sort of float around them a bit, and some are essential services, or some are consumption. So I think there's we might give today. I'm sure someone can go away and do that, look through those, and find where culture and creativity sits. But if you come from a much stronger sense of culture and creativity as being part of humanity, an essence of humanity in the individual, and collective human flourishing, well, there are one or two individuals who are pushing some very interesting things around, you know, cultural democracy driven by cultural capability. So cultural capability is like another way of thinking about infrastructures of being a person in a place, and you invest in that, and all those other things which I've talked about, like economy, social, cultural value, would flow from this almost intrinsic investment in those individuals. And Banks has even talked about a notion of creative and contributive justice, which is again a universal opportunity to undertake public cultural work for everyone, because it's part of being a human, and actually comes from a very. And you take that as a given before you start thinking about other things. So that, you know, and I guess if you think for me about how you'd invest in that and so forth, that flips it. But that creative and contributive justice, universal opportunity, some people connect that up with things like the universal basic income. Yeah, so you could think of it as about a cultural and creative version of the universal basic income, which we've been talking about how populations survive in their local economies, given current poverty. And that may sound a bit pie in the sky, except that in Ireland, there is a basic income for artists, which has been introduced in Ireland, which has been piloted for the last year, where they are giving roughly £300 a month or €325 a month to 2,000 artists in Ireland as a basic income, recognising the precarity of artists' livelihoods on one hand, but on the other hand, that what artists do in terms of public good, social goods for society, needs to be valued and nurtured. Yeah, so that's an example of investing into a cultural capability, and we'll see what happens. It might create an entrepreneur, it might create an ecologist, it might create so that's very different to investing to try and win. Although it's great news that we are finally going to get a gigafactory in Somerset, because it's critical to the UK, but it's a very different way to chasing mobile capital R&D, science-based things and so forth. And I'm not against that. What I'm trying to show is that when you use the term diverse economies, that's how we should understand the economy. They're overlapping economic systems of activity, and it's the layering and combination of those which make up a place. And currently, my hope would be that the reframing of urban and regional development takes that view of place rather than just a left behind place. It recognises a place more generally and starts investing in other bits of place as well as the ones we normally invest in. So coming to the punchline. So if we thought of creative freelancing as precarious, low income, non-growth orientated and difficult to manage sector, that's one approach, and that's why there's that work going on in the last few years. And that's why they absolutely got hammered with furlough and self-employment schemes. They just fell out of the system entirely. We had the biggest investment ever in supporting the economy in the last 3 years, in the pandemic, and creative freelancing just wasn't part of it. Yeah, incredible. And so that shows what we mean about not understanding key bits of the economy. And so it's not surprising that Walter and Forrester are sitting there going, as a local economic development policy officer, trying to work out how the hell to deal with this great asset in their area, but they can't get a handle on it. Whereas now, I guess, in many places, creative freelancing is a critical aspect of the ecology and infrastructure of place, delivering diverse place-based outcomes of economic, social, and cultural value. And we need to recognise that. And I don't. That's just creative freelancing as an example, but to try and think through what that means for other bits of economic and social infrastructure, and how we invest in them for place-based outcomes, so that hopefully we don't get left behind places. Okay, thank you very much.
Very interesting talk. So do you have any questions from the audience? Yes, please. For me.
It was really interesting. I've got probably a bit practical or policy question. I thought your recommendation was really interesting, fascinating, like infrastructure side and place-based. I'm just sort of thinking, who do you recommend these points to? I was just thinking, like when it comes to place-based policy recommendations, like the local authorities, I think it kind of depends how the culture of their creative bit is sitting in relation to economic development or planning unit. So it just kind of depends who are listening to these recommendations, who's going to implement it along with the sector or more.
Sure. So I think the first point is that you've defaulted to local authorities, which I think is good, because they are they've been emasculated clearly in the UK especially, but they are the democratic local institutions who are in charge of place. They can't do it alone. They have to have support from, and we're seeing devolution and so forth. So that would be my first point. My second point is that actually, if you look across local authorities, there's almost a bifurcation. Most are doing culture and creativity. The question is whether they're doing it through attracting conferences, attracting mega events, tourism, or whether increasingly some have been doing it through, if we take a community-based issue around social cohesion and exclusion, how do we get people to get involved? Well, we bring them along to do local cultural participation activities, such as book clubs, knitting circles, using outdoor public spaces. So I think it's there if you and actually working with Coventry City Council, they are using those arts and cultural methods to try and engage with hard to reach citizens and so forth. So they're trying different routes to deliver services, and then once you bring them into the system. So that would be one example, but it can't be local authorities alone. But the problem is, in the last 10 years, the local authority investment into culture and creativity has gone down massively because they're being pared back to the bones. But you see lots of local initiatives and examples. But I think that's very much in the UK system. That's very much connected with what are we going to devolve down from the centre into the deals, and whether we recognise what local authorities should and can be. Whereas we spent a lot of time trying to avoid putting money through local authorities for the last decade or so.
Thanks, Nick. Enjoyed that. I really like the typology you set out. I guess one straightforward question and one slightly more maybe complicated. Have you any idea how many percentage of the whole population sits in each of the typologies? Can you break it down in terms of numbers of people or firms? So which is the biggest and which is the smallest? Slightly more difficult though. We've done a bit of work on game software, online gaming, and one of the conclusions we came to is quite a lot of value did not end up in the place. Leverage and Spark being replaced. So could you differentiate across those different types, kind of more or less local outcomes to place, depending on the processes of engagement and the subsector they're involved in? Is that feasible?
Yeah, so I'll take the first one first. Yeah, on the segmentation. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great question, and the answer is don't know. And one of the reasons why we don't know is because the vast majority of those people we've counted there just don't exist in the statistics. Yeah? They're below the radar. Yeah, and that whole sense of, and there's a fluidity because there might be sole traders, they might be, they might be paying some form of national insurance, they might be micro enterprises. They might, I mean, there's 4 or 5 different ways in which they might be counted, and they move across them. But in the end, they're micro, they're that below. So literally, we have in our official statistics, we have very little ability to get that low and that granular. So I think it's a real challenge, an important challenge, because it comes back to that point of missing part of your economy in some senses. I think your second point is also spot on, actually, because absolutely, there's greater and lesser ability for the money to stick and keep recirculating. And I think, and I said it, I mean, my understanding of the work which the Centre for Local Economic Strategies do is they would also be working on the fact that once the pound's in the region, you can keep circulating it, and creating those different forms of value. So I do think, I think that would be a really good criterion for, if you're going to start developing policy and why you're intervening. I think that, I think that's a really good way of doing it. And as I say, I'm not against, because I think, Silicon Spark, I mean, that is a cluster. We have hundreds of clusters in this country. I would probably identify 30 at the most, but I mean, that is one. That's a world.
George Freeman has the same number.
So I do think, and it's important to have those, and actually, but we know that those gaming the people who work in those gaming countries may well have come from creative communities where their first sense of getting in, because they want the creativity as well as the coding, if you like, crudely put, and that creativity will have come from individuals like this who may well have got their creativity from going to the local museum or going to the library. That's my point. The argument would be that actually those bits are part of the R&D system of this front-end world-class gaming industry, and that's. But I absolutely get your point about how you. So then you get into the value chain notion, but also, when we talk about ecosystems and the framings, and that's my point of just being a bit more careful in thinking about those, because we're used to doing it through car plants and tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, and training into FE colleges and stuff. And yet there's a very different system of labour and innovatory and knowledge production going on here, if you like. And I guess for me, that's my lineage from the work I did way back on Motorsport Valley, which also still does not exist in official statistics. You can't find it in official statistics yet. It's got to be one of the most successful clusters in the world. Okay, thanks.
Juliana, I'm afraid that's going to be the last question for the audience in the room. We have to go on time now.
One thing you said was very interesting in the whole dilemma of freelancers. amazingly, absolute and really put together in a very nice. I would love to just go a little bit back to your typology and ask you something about what you said, a bit like, just, and Kate got me thinking that you had like a fluid and dynamic on top of the cluster, and this, I think, is a wonderful metaphor. And I wonder if you could, I know it's the main point of your talk, but in being interested in cluster or and how they work. But you seem to argue, and if I understood you correctly, there's some fluidity on top of it, which needs to be quite agile to kind of to react to what's happening, like politically, or what's happening, in the economy as a whole. I wonder if any other thoughts about it.
I mean, I think, okay, policy is always, I think, well, I guess we use the language of the real economy. Actually, we often use the language of the real economy, yet we tend to forget that when we get into policy making. Yeah. And we have to, and it's quite, we have to count, we're in a world of measurement and metrics, and we have to make things solid and create boundaries, and it helps analytically and it helps policymakers. I think my point is that be pragmatic about that and recognize that the real economy is shifting and changing. And it's a bit like, having to redo the standard industrial classification every 20 years and knowing that they're, to try and catch up with how the real economy. So that would be, and I actually think the economy is becoming, as society is becoming, we've got time-space compression, it's becoming more fluid and more dynamic. The notion of the lifelong career no longer exists. Where do people want, the notion that people actually move, increasingly people move every 2 or 3 years in terms of the, just if you're thinking about the labour market, the notion that you've got to reskill and so this fluidity and dynamism, we need to try and reflect it. I think it's an organisational characteristic of new forms of economy, and I think, and therefore it pops up very different notions of where are the key assets and synergies. I don't know whether that answers your question, and it's a question of mapping those and seeing how those relationships build. And I think we get stuck in, I mean, it is that fluidity is coming through in those different formed conceptualizations of the economy, and it's great. I'm doing culture and creativity, but as an economic geographer, it's a great moment in time because we thought it was going to happen after the global financial crisis, and it didn't. We basically recapitalized the banks and off they went again. And what's happened this time? The first thing which happened is the banks withdraw all the money again as soon as they see a bit of risk. But furloughing was the first time we saw quantitative easing for the people rather than for capital. We can argue about that. But, so it is a moment of reflection and fluidity in our theorizing as well, and moments where I think policymakers are listening. Or scrapping it, and there are others who are doing much better, who are people like Andreas Rodriguez, Jose, and so forth, who are really capturing some of this and doing it in policy making fields. But I just think, there's a semi moment where we've got some fluidity to try and influence, but it involves both putting definitions and boundaries around things, but recognizing that they're porous. They're a pragmatic use to get a handle on things, but they don't set them in stone. Always have that sense, that relational sense, which of course, I was trained by Doreen Massey, etc. So I've always had that relational sense of economy from way back. And I think it's probably more pertinent today than ever from where I come from. And I still believe in structures, even though there's post-structuralism, etc.
Thanks. I think we have time for one last question online from James, and his question is about the speciality of work on freelancer creative ecosystems. And how those new positions and relationship.
So Yeah, so, so I mean. So yes, so technology and virtuality will change the geographies of working. Yeah, absolutely. How it will play out, I don't know. Will it therefore dissipate clustering of things? If I'm honest, I don't know. All I would do is say that through history, contractive waves would be the example, where every 50 years we get a new technological wave, and we've heard the end of, I mean, I do think there's a notion of end of work with AI, but it will restructure the geographies and spaces, and we've heard, the end of globalization was 20 years ago, everything's flat, yeah? What we found was that actually where you chose to be was even more important than ever before, except that you had to choose across a global landscape rather than a national or regional landscape. So my answer is yes, but technology doesn't flatten space. It will reorientate it and change it. It doesn't remove, because technologies and infrastructures of technologies themselves define where you can locate. Creative, do you get 5G? Not in large parts of this country. So, I mean, and it's simple things like that. And all the work on infrastructures which sits behind technologies. So I still believe in uneven development, and technology will reshape and change it, and it has done historically. And it's important that we try and understand those. And yeah, there's a particular moment again around remote working and virtual working and so forth, but space and place will out, but it may be the new formulation.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, but we don't have time for Stephen's question. And thank you very much. And thanks for the wonderful talk. Yeah.